The English Civil Wars, 1642 to 1651, were a sequence of destructive battles that took place in the middle of the 17th century. At the heart of the upheaval was a titanic power struggle between King Charles I and Parliament, with battle lines drawn across deep and intricate political, religious, and economic divisions. The English Civil Wars were the best known among the conflicts of the larger War of Three Kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland. Path to War. After King James' death in 1625, his son Charles I ascended to the throne as king of three separate kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland. Within 4 years after Charles' crowning, numerous unpopular measures, most notably the ship money tax, had brought the long-standing religious, political, and social disputes in the British Isles into a climax. In 1629, Charles began what was known as the personal rule, or by his enemies the 11-year tyranny, during which he dismissed all his members of Parliament and ruled England without a Parliament for the next 11 years. From the late 1630s, Charles attempted to develop a more English-style religious practice in Scotland, drawing severe opposition from the Scottish Presbyterians, a branch of Protestantism in the kingdom. Aiming to bring the rebellious Scots to heel, in 1639, an army led by Charles I arrived in Scotland and fought the First Bishops' War, but was quickly overwhelmed by the experienced Scottish army, forcing the king to sign a peace treaty at Berwick. The king, however, refused to concede the Scots' victory, and recalled a special session of Parliament to finance another war. Parliament assembled in April 1640, but was dismissed after only 3 weeks, and hence became known as the Short Parliament. Without the money to fight, the king's army was defeated disastrously in the Second Bishops' War in the summer of 1640, and the Scots successfully occupied northern England. Demoralized and humiliated, the king had no choice but to negotiate and recall a new parliament, which became the Long Parliament, to settle the conflict. In October 1641, during the political instability in London, the Catholic majority in Ireland revolted, massacring hundreds of Protestants. The violence heightened tension in England as Charles and Parliament did not see eye to eye on how to settle the rebellion. With continuous disagreement on military command, constitutional aspects, and especially religion, Parliament presented a list of grievances against the king known as the Grand Remonstrance to Charles in December 1641. In response to this, in early 1642, the king tried but failed to arrest his leading opponents in Parliament, with Parliament taking control of the London militias and the Tower of London, and fearing for his safety, Charles escaped London for northern England, and urged his allies to prepare for war. Minor fighting between the king and the Parliament began in midsummer, as each side started to compete for its own power. On the 22nd of August, 1642, King Charles I raised his royal standard at Nottingham, officially marking the onset of the First Civil War. The First Civil War, 1642 to 1646. The First Civil War was fought between the Royalists, or the Cavaliers, the King supporters, and the Parliamentarians, or the Roundheads, commanded by Robert de Vereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex. The first major battle of the war happened at Edge Hill, southern Warwickshire, England, in October 1642. The battle was inconclusive, and the king's army then marched on London, but was stopped at Turnham Green by Essex's expanded force. Small-scale fighting occurred later that year, during which the king established his headquarters at Oxford, Fighting was widespread mainly by smaller forces in regional areas, resulting in royalists holding all of northern England and parliamentarians controlling the southeast, including London. After gaining victory in the Battle of Adwalton Moor, the king held two-thirds of England and Wales, and appeared to be gaining the upper hand with the Irish troops joining the royalists. However, in January 1644, a significant alliance between the parliamentarians and Scotland, which resulted in a strong Scottish force, entered the fight. With the help of the Scots, the parliamentarians won a decisive victory 6 months later at Marston Moor, west of York, leading to the collapse of the royalist cause in the north. This decisive victory also paved the way for the reform of the parliamentary armies, with the creation of the new model army under the command of Sir Thomas Fairfax, the third Lord Fairfax of Cameron, and Oliver Cromwell, the commander-in-chief. The new model army moved against the royalist forces and scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Naseby, effectively destroying the royalist forces. Charles I was handed over to the parliamentarians, marking the end of the First Civil War. The Second Civil War, 1648. Despite defeat in the war, Charles refused to surrender and sought to exploit his opponent's religious and political differences. In December 1647, from the Isle of Wight, where he was being held prisoner at Carisbrooke Castle, Charles concluded a peace treaty with some leading Scots, in which they promised to join forces with the English royalists and restore the king's power in return for religious settlement in England. Shortly afterward, a series of armed uprisings began in the spring and summer of 1648 in favor of the king, marking the bloody and merciless fighting of the Second Civil War. In South Wales, Cromwell and the new model army quickly crushed a revolt of former parliamentarians at St. Fagans in early May, followed by the siege of Pembroke later that month. At the same time, Fairfax and his troops beat the Kentish royalists at Maidstone. Smaller uprisings occurred in Cornwall, North Wales, Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and Surrey, though all were quickly put down by Parliament. And at long last, the Battle of Preston in August ended with the decisive defeat and surrender of the Scots. Charles was found guilty of high treason and was executed by beheading in Whitehall, London, on the 30th of January, 1649. The Second Civil War came to an end. The Third Civil War, 1649 to 1651. Following Charles' death, a Republican government was created in England supported by the new model army's military might. Cromwell's army launched a victorious reconquest of Ireland, beginning late in 1649, including the infamous massacre of thousands of Irish and Royalist troops and citizens at Drogheda. Meanwhile, in 1650, the Scots signed the Treaty of Breda with the executed king's eldest son, King Charles II of Scotland, who was crowned in early 1651. Charles II had gathered an army of English and Scottish royalists even before he was legally anointed, compelling Cromwell to invade Scotland. After being beaten at Dunbar in September 1650 and at Inverkeithing in July 1651 by Cromwell's forces, Charles II led an army driving south to invade England, but only to be defeated by a massive parliamentarian army at Worcester. Although the young king narrowly averted captivity, the overwhelming victory of Cromwell and the Parliament brought the Third English Civil War, as well as the broader War of the Three Kingdoms, to an end. The impact of the wars. The English civil wars were long and deadly battles that shattered society at all levels, dividing families, villages, cities, and counties across the kingdom. The conflict resulted in massive amounts of injury, death, psychological suffering, pillage, and destruction in many parts of England. Up to 200,000 civilians and soldiers, accounting for 4.5% of the population, died as a result of warfare and diseases carried by marching forces. That loss was proportionally as great as that of the First World War in 1914.